today.
All right, thanks, Jamie. So welcome, everybody. My name is Chris Price. I'm Jamie's colleague at the SUNY Center for Professional Development. My role there is Academic Programs Manager. So like Jamie, I help develop professional development programs across SUNY, especially those for faculty. I also work with the faculty development community of practice. So the folks who work in teaching and learning centers and SUNY campuses, direct them, faculty who work there. But today I'm actually going to be talking to you more as an instructor myself. So before I started at the CPD, I was at SUNY Brockport and I taught there, and I still do continue to teach there. So I'm going to talk to you about some strategies that I use in the courses, one of the courses I still teach for them online. So, and now I'll let my colleague from Columbia Green, Nicole, introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Childrose. I am a history professor at Columbia Green Community College. Also at the college, I serve in a non-academic assessment chair role. I also co-chair our division of technical professions. So in my role, I really lean on the technology, not only for purely online classes that I teach, but I also have developed and teach hybrid and high flex classes. I have developed and teach introductory college success, college skills courses, and have become over the years really fluent with our learning management system. And in the past 2 years, mainly as a response to the pandemic, have worked on with a colleague developing an online student passport orientation, which has helped really onboard our students who were really largely a culture of in-person to the kinds of technology that we use in fully online and blended courses. So I'm excited to be here today and discuss some methods and tips and tricks that I find really helpful, time-saving, and essential in the bulk of what we do as educators, which is to provide students feedback.
Thanks, Nicole. So I just put in the chat there a link to a Google Doc that we'd like everyone to fill it out. And we've asked for your names and emails just because, when Nicole and I were talking about the session, we thought it'd be good if, you could make connections with other people that maybe, if they're doing something that you want to learn more about outside of the session, you could touch base with them and make a connection outside of the Otter Institute. I know that I agreed to do this because I think giving feedback is probably the most important thing we can do as instructors to help our students learn, right? I mean, we know that there's content everywhere. Students can actually be exposed to content without us, right? But the value add that we all kind of bring to the table in most of our courses is not, yes, it may be explaining the content in ways that's accessible to students, but it really is mostly giving them feedback as they learn the content, and either both group feedback and also individual feedback. So some of the suggestions we'll give today deal with both types of feedback that you give students individually and feedback that you give students as a whole class. So if you could just fill out that Google Doc. I've asked these questions that are on there are the ones that are in the Google Doc. So what are you currently doing to provide feedback? And then what is your biggest challenge? So I'm just going to kind of go over there myself. And I was able to look a little bit while we were waiting for those who were able to get in there early about, what you're currently doing. So I'm just going to kind of go through the document and kind of look at what folks have had to say. Being timely, I see Madeline put initially, I think they say the timely feedback is the most important thing you could do, right? Because if feedback comes too late, students might not be able to understand exactly what it is they did that they're getting feedback on. So the timeliness of feedback is super important. And, again, what that means, I mean, I think that it depends on the course, depends on the content, but, certainly you want to give feedback as soon as you can after students complete something. Not being overly involved in discussion boards to allow for student interaction. Okay. And then, but that timeliness is actually the challenge, right? So like getting feedback done in a timely manner, especially if you're teaching 5, 6, maybe 7, 8 classes. Some people, folks teach. It is hard to do things in a timely fashion and do it well, right? And so today we're going to give you a few suggestions on how to do that. So I'm just looking through the list here. Steve does general comments on discussion boards and specific in the gradebook. So there we're talking about, that group versus individual feedback, but challenge is students actually reading, reacting to the feedback, right? That is a challenge. And I know it's something that we all kind of, as we're giving students feedback, especially written feedback on papers and significant assignments, we think, are they going to actually read this, or is this going to go nowhere? And that, I think, is probably the most frustrating thing. When you talk to instructors, a lot of times they say, oh, I love teaching, but grading is something that I hate. And I think there are many reasons why instructors hate grading. But I think a big reason is that we feel like, okay, well, all students focus on is the grade, and they don't focus on the piece that really matters. That is the feedback we give them about why they got the grade that they earned on that assignment. And so, usually, but you have to give a grade, right? In most circumstances, or maybe not. And I'll talk about that shortly in the approach I use to grading. But, we want them to look at that feedback and really internalize that more than we want them to internalize the actual letter grade or whatever type of grade we're using. And so that is definitely a challenge, how to get them to actually respond to it, read it, understand it, and then use it to improve, right? All right, so I'm just kind of looking down the list here. Discussion boards, a lot of you, I guess, using discussion boards and giving feedback on that. There's a challenge here, students who are not engaged. Okay, so yeah, that is a challenge, and feedback, if they're not engaged, they're not usually going to internalize the feedback. Let's see here, self-checks. Jamie does self-checks for students to self-assess progress of materials. Yeah, so a lot of times, what we want to do is have students listen to our feedback, but then kind of incorporate that feedback into their own kind of process for learning the material, and almost hear what we have to say in their own heads and in their own language and in their own way of understanding, so that they can kind of internalize those feedback loops and be able to be to self-assess their work, right? So that's a great practice, Jamie. And Jamie's got some good Kahoot exam reviews, discussion forums reviews. Okay, let's see here. Just kind of looking through. Check-ins with students, timely feedback, in-class face-to-face feedback, right? That's always a good way to give feedback. We always think of feedback as being something that we have to write to students, but it can be more effective if you actually have a chance to actually sit down with students and talk with them, either in real time or asynchronously. And I'm going to show how I use asynchronous actual verbal feedback in my classes shortly. Challenge, students do not read feedback. Okay, so we're seeing a lot of similar comments here with challenges that actually students actually reading the feedback that we give them. Let's see here. Okay, detailed feedback, Dave saying, on each assignment and discussion in the LMS. Okay. A big issue, getting faculty to attend the training sessions on feedback. Okay, or participate in training. Oh, I see. You're talking about in the context of how to give feedback on quizzes, right? And then Nicole is going to talk a lot when she talks about her process of giving students feedback about how she utilizes the tools in the learning management system to give students feedback. That is one of the advantages, I think, of teaching online, is that you really do have various ways to give students feedback utilizing the learning management system or other types of technology as well. In a face-to-face class, obviously you have those tools as well, but in the online class, students are obviously, the only way they have to access the course, the only classroom they have is the LMS. And so the trick is, of course, is getting students to see that once you put that in there. Okay, there are rubrics in the Blackboard LMS, right? So you can use, Jennifer Smalls is saying she uses the rubrics in Blackboard and on written assignments as well. Challenges getting students to apply the feedback on their future submissions, right? And so feedback is only useful if students use it. And so trying to get them to actually read it and use it. Okay, and then finally, Nancy says she uses Audacity audio recordings to go over why correct or incorrect answers to short answer questions are so. So using audio feedback for assignments, and then face-to-face feedback over Zoom or in person. So I'm going to pop in the chat one more time the link to that Google Doc. So if you didn't get a chance to fill it out, please feel free, go ahead and do that. At some point, we'd like to hear from you, even if you didn't get in then, and if only to, like I said before, create any connections or between you, and maybe you'll be able to reach out to somebody else who's attending today. Nicole, you want to add anything to, we're unable to see it because you've got the slide deck up, but I don't know, anything that I said that resonated or anything you want to add?
Yeah, I guess I can actually advance to the next slide if that's okay, because I think our list sort of, mirrors and echoes what I'm hearing. And I think actually for me, it was a really fun process to sort of brainstorm with Chris, who, is approaching the design and delivery of somewhat different classes than what I teach. And I think we can sort of take a step back and think about all of our modalities, not just online or remote, and that sort of brainstorming really helped me just go back to the roots of what is essential. So top on our list was just the ongoing and consistent and timely feedback, and this is so critical regardless of what modality you're teaching in. And so I'll probably speak a little bit about this, but since this came up so much in our Google Doc as well, for me, so I'll actually design a course where I'm just sort of populating my announcements. After years of teaching a course, we can tend to predict, what students will have challenges with. So I'll do that at the beginning of a semester, and then I'll fill in from there. And I try to have, for my numbers, at least 4 announcements a week. And I'll talk more in my examples about how I'm trying to measure, the readership of those and the inclusion of those on assignments. Another rule that I live by is just praising in public and critiquing in the privacy of the grade center. I think there can be nothing more humiliating and demoralizing and, kill the motivation for a student than, an instructor in I'm thinking, how could I do the worst job with feedback? Might be, a critique in a discussion. In my view, I want to really build students up and then provide that constructive feedback in private, in the safety of where we can, have a one-on-one about that, or at least, typing out that feedback so it's for that student's eyes only. I think it's great to play devil's advocate in a discussion and forward and further a discussion, but, things that they can work on, I'm going to list those in private to a student. I really like sandwiching feedback. So I think we can always find for any student something that we can, feel is really positive that they're doing in a class, and then areas that are in need of attention. So I try to, for every, negative, I'll give a positive. And again, I think that just keeps them in tune to what we're saying. I think it keeps the motivation up and the morale up. And I always, and I know, Chris, you talked about this in your classes, providing those models and examples. I think that's so helpful for a student to see a model and use that to their advantage. Also, using authentic language of our disciplines, providing feedback is a great way to expose students to the technical language that you're the expert in and make that part of their vocabulary and their thinking. I always try to structure, and I'll show you a sample of this, my written or annotated like inline grading feedback, say on a paper or maybe a blog that a student has written, structuring that feedback as a question that's in need of a response. So I'll ask a question or I'll pose a question, and then I'll be looking for that in a future assignment. Providing opportunities for peer feedback, I think, addresses one of our themes of not only saving time, but also increasing engagement and really being able to check if students are getting what you're saying. So if we're giving each student an opportunity to provide constructive feedback to another, they're practicing what we've been preaching all along. And if and whenever possible, just bringing other colleagues into the process. So if you're building a rubric that you plan to use in courses, that's a great opportunity for a fresh set of eyes, a fresh perspective, some collaboration within your discipline, and even maybe having students take part in that process to build a really great rubric that you can use over and over again, as well as providing opportunities for students to show that they incorporate the feedback. So we will show you how we're doing this. And again, that's a big thing that we want to just really close that loop. So I'll advance to your slide, Chris.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, so we will definitely give you some examples of how we're doing all this shortly, but we first wanted to kind of lay out like some of these best practices. And what Nicole just talked about, regardless of modality, those are all good practices. And I would say even here too, feedback best practices utilizing technology. I mean, it doesn't really matter if you're teaching a 100% online course or a face-to-face course. I think all the things that are here can be utilized in any modality as well. But we wanted to give you, since this is the Otter Institute, we wanted to give you some suggestions about ways you could utilize technology to give students effective feedback. And so, and the first suggestion probably applies to anything that any good instructional technologist or designer will tell you about technology, right? So leverage it, but don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel, like beg, steal, borrow from others, right? As somebody that I know in higher ed always says, like, all these things that I'm telling you, take them and then drive them like you stole them, take them and take off with them, and do your own thing, right? Don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel, and just, try to, do what works best for you, and don't let the perfect be the enemy of good. So all the suggestions we're giving you here, maybe there's another way to do it, do that way if that works better for you. But set clear expectations about how you're going to use the technology and what students are going to need to do to engage with it, right? And so make sure students know how you're using whatever it is you choose to use, and that they understand how that is going to be, and that it's clear to them, right? So but then personalize it. Make sure that it's not just, sometimes canned feedback can be useful, right? I mean, I know that if you're utilizing, say, a grading tool in Blackboard, there is all sorts of templates you can use, and but make sure you're utilizing that personally and not just kind of having it all be canned. I mean, students will see through that very quickly. So be very careful about how you utilize things that are templates and canned feedback so that it is effective and not so transparent that students just kind of ignore it. And the LMS is kind of the first place you should go, I think, when looking at technology solutions for your class, because that's where everyone is. And, and I always think of the LMS, it's like a Swiss Army knife, right? It does a lot of things, maybe not the best, but again, it does a lot of things. And so, but it may not do everything. And so there are the tools like simple email, right? Just to email students feedback, and not, students don't always check email, but they do more often, I think, than not. And so sometimes an email is better than something in the LMS. There are other tools like SafeAssign or Turnitin. SafeAssign is obviously in the LMS. It's Blackboard's plagiarism software, but it has also a lot of good feedback tools in it, but you can utilize those tools even if they aren't within Blackboard in the case of something like Turnitin. There are a lot of live polling tools. Mentimeter is one. I know Jamie's been using that a lot, where you can actually get feedback in real time from students with your slide deck. And that's also, we think of feedback as something that happens maybe over the course of a long period of time, but feedback can be something that's a little bit more immediate, right? All right, so make sure you do things multimodal. A lot of you said this in the Google Doc, right? Written feedback is important, but sometimes students need to hear it as well, and maybe even see you And maybe that's not just something recorded, but maybe it is in real time, or maybe it's over the phone, or maybe it's in Zoom one-on-one. So, especially for significant assignments in your course, try to figure out maybe different ways to give them feedback if it's something that's essential for their success in the course. Accessibility is very important with technology. I think that, you make sure that whatever you're giving them is going to be accessible. So that's especially true for any audio that you give them. Make sure that if, that if the student requires an accommodation, that they have it in text, that you do it as well. Anything built-in achievements in courses or ways to sort of unlock assignments in Blackboard, you could utilize those achievements so that students get feedback as they progress, and it's sort of time to whatever it is they have to accomplish within the course. That's a really, I think, underutilized tool in most LMSs. I've already said one-on-one meetings are good if you have a small enough class, or even larger classes, even if it's just 5 minutes or 10 minutes. I mean, that's easy enough to do in Zoom, right? Just pop in at this time, we'll just have a quick check-in. And then, if you can do that, that's a good thing to do. And then finally, interactive is great. So, we talked about doing feedback in real time. So if you can use live polling or blogging or announcement, any way you can kind of make it more interactive and engaging, right? So I think that's probably the one takeaway from all of this, is that feedback, just like everything in your course, has to be engaging. If students aren't engaging with it, it's not working. And so we have to think about it just like we do with our content. We have to think about our feedback in the same kind of way. All right. Anything in the chat there that I want to know? Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to pause here. I don't see any questions in the chat about anything we've gone over in the last couple of slides. Just, okay, no, okay. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to talk about feedback in one of my undergraduate online course. And then Nicole's going to talk about feedback in her courses. But if you have questions, we're going to save time at the end for questions and discussion. But if you have questions, for my piece, just put them in the chat and I'll pause before I turn it over to Nicole. And if anything's really pressing about something I've gone over, I'll talk about it. But if not, I'll just hand the baton over to Nicole. All right. Okay, so the course I'm going to talk to you about is my undergraduate online course, which is Introduction to Liberal Studies. And essentially this course, my background is I'm a political scientist, but I've been teaching this liberal studies course for about 10 years. And it's the introductory course to this program. And it basically is a course about, I always like to say, it's a course about all of knowledge, but it's more about students learning how knowledge is formed in different ways. And so the overall objective of the course is less that they get everything right in terms of the content, but more that they understand how knowledge is formed in different ways in the humanities, in the social sciences, in the fine arts, and the natural sciences and mathematics. And so it's really a very process-based course in that they're constantly being introduced to different types of content and different subject matter. And the feedback that I'm giving them is more about the process of what you need to do to interact with different forms of knowledge than the knowledge itself. So it's a little bit tricky to get students to understand that concept from the get-go. So the type of feedback I'm giving them is very different than the feedback they're getting in their, say, courses in their major, where it's really a lot about the content, learning the content. For this, it's more about learning about different modes of knowing. And so I've already kind of gotten behind the 8-ball a little bit, and it's a little tricky for me to give them effective feedback, or for them to understand what feedback they need. The other thing about my course that you should know is that I utilize specifications grading. I could do a whole session on specifications grading, so I don't want to get too in the weeds with it, but all you really need to know at this point with specifications grading is that all the assignments in the course are graded either complete or not complete. And so there are no letter grades on anything that they do in the course. Their final grade is essentially determined by the number of assignments they complete successfully. And so as you probably guessed, to get an A, they have to complete, the most number of assignments, B a little bit less, C a little bit less, D even less than that. And so that's also puts a onus on me to make sure that they know if they don't get credit for an assignment, that my feedback is effective, because they typically have the opportunity to redo an assignment. And so obviously the feedback, and I went to this form of grading mostly because I wanted students to listen to my feedback. I wanted them to incorporate it. And so since if they have to redo something, they're a lot more likely to listen to your feedback or to take it in and engage with it, right? So my feedback is really important. And as I said before, it's typically around the assignment specifications. That's what you call like the requirements for an assignment in specifications grading. And so the significant types of assignments they do in this is an online class are discussions, online discussions. They have 4 papers, and they have a research project that they complete throughout the semester. And so I'm going to talk about the feedback I do for each of these assignments. Next slide, Nicole. So the first thing is the discussions. And so, oh, excuse me, the module papers. I'm looking right at the module papers are the kind of, where they really have to engage with, as I said before, a different work in each of the major sort of discipline clusters, I call them. So there are 4 of them, and so there are 4 papers. And one of the things that are a challenge with this type of grading is that if they meet the specifications and they get credit, they're less likely to listen to the feedback, right? Because they've already got credit, and the next paper is going to be on a kind of a different subject altogether. And so I wasn't going to give them sort of written out, detailed written feedback, because I felt like A, they're less likely to read it, and B, it's just not as important for them that they got every nitty gritty of the topic right, because we're moving on to something completely different in the next module. So I wanted to figure out a way to give them some feedback about the paper, what I thought of it. I didn't want it to take too much of my time, and I wanted to be kind of engaging and put myself into the course, right? In an online course, we're always looking for ways to have instructor presence, to put it in that, that term. And so this is a way I thought, well, maybe I'll just give them audio comments. And I used to be able to do it really easy and Turnitin. And then when Brockport got rid of Turnitin, I thought I couldn't do it anymore until I just talked to the guy at Brockport. He said, oh no, this is how you do it in Blackboard. And so I'm just going to show you a few slides, and I've showed a few people this recently. I'm like, oh, I didn't know I could do that in Blackboard. I believe this is turned on for everybody in Blackboard. I may be wrong. I know everybody's Blackboard's a little different. If you have any IDs in here, you could let us know if your campus, if it is true that it is in all instances of Blackboard, but hopefully it is in yours. Okay, so Nicole, next slide.
Okay, and just as I transition slide, Chris, to acknowledge the chat, are you ungrading?
Specifications grading, I wouldn't describe it as ungrading because, well, it's, I guess, on the spectrum because, again, there is no grade on individual assignments. I have to give them a grade at the end, and it is determined on, an A through E scale. So I guess it's kind of ungrading, but it's really not so far down the line of complete ungrading. But I try to de-emphasize the letter grade, which I think is the spirit of ungrading. So thanks, good question, Rob. I might get there at some point to the complete ungrading. So I think specifications grading, just as an aside, is a good first step for those of you that are like, I don't want to do grades, but I don't want to do something so radical that it maybe upsets my chair. So that book, that Linda Nilsson book on specifications grading, and there's like short articles on it if you want. And if you want, I'll send it to you. Just email me. All right. So really quickly, here's how you do audio comments in Blackboard. And some of you may already know this, so I apologize if you do. So here's a screenshot of the feedback editor in Blackboard and in the module papers. This was a dummy account that I used, so it was me, the dummy, but I just uploaded a fake paper. And so you go into that feedback to learner section, you click on that little A there in the bottom right hand corner, which will bring up the assignment editor, which is the next slide. So once you're in that assignment feedback editor, you have all these options, right? You should see that little microphone on the left there. You're going to go ahead and click that. And then you're going to probably get first a little box. It's the first time you're using it, grant Blackboard permission to use your mic. and webcam. So I clicked that. I don't use my webcam because I typically do this, laying out on my couch, trying to get as comfy as possible when I'm grading. So I don't want them to see me. So I'll just do an audio recording. And so you just click on the little red button. All right, and then you record it. So I didn't screen cap the recording button, but after you're done recording it, I think it gives you up to 3 minutes. You can review it. And I recommend you do that too, because to make sure that they heard it okay. So you would go ahead, click that play button, and then you would hear what you just said to them, or you could scroll to the end just to make sure that it came through. Then you click save and exit. And then you basically just insert the recording into that little box on that first screen. Next slide. Yep. And so once you're done, you'll just see this. And then you could put the grade in. So you'll see there my scoring is just a 1. So that when you do, because there's no like in the grade book, it shows incomplete or complete check marks for assignments, but there's no way to put just a check mark in Blackboard. So I just say a 1 is complete, a 0, nothing is incomplete. So then you submit it. And then when the student logs in, if there is an audio comment, they'll see, so you see that student got it correct, the paper was complete, and they'll see that little box if they to review the comment. So if you click on that, next slide, Nicole, this will come up, and then they just click on that little box right there, and they'll hear what I had to say about their paper. All right. So yeah, so Steve said, I see that Steve does not have an audio record function. So, I know nothing about this, but I would talk to whoever it is that controls those features on your campus and see if it could be added. I don't think it's extra. I think it's just a thing that the admin needs to turn on. Anybody know better than me if that's the right answer to this? So good request, Rebecca. So it does not do closed captioning. And so that's why, right, to pay attention to accessibility. So if you have a student that needs captions, then you definitely, this isn't going to work for them, and you have to, what you could do instead of this is you could in Google Docs you could speak out what you want to say and use some kind of voice to text option if you want to have that kind of flow of talking to someone that required a text-based option. Or you could use Screencast-O-Matic too as well. And again, as I said earlier, there's going to be a ton of different ways you could use audio for feedback, right? And so I would just recommend what works best for you and use that. But like I said, right in Blackboard, like this was really easy. Okay. Any other questions? All right, so that's if they meet the specifications. If they don't meet the specifications, I actually just send them an email. I don't even, I don't even use because the other thing about Blackboard is if you have to give them a grade to submit, right? So you can't just have a 0. I suppose you could have a 0 as a grade or no grade, but if you have a 0, the way I do it in the Grade Center, it shows up as a check mark because I use the incomplete, complete marking in Blackboard. So I don't want to give them a 0 because they're going to think they got it complete. So if they didn't meet the specifications, I read through it, and then I don't do any of the marks or any of the grading in Blackboard itself. I just write up in an email, and as an example, on the next slide, Nicole. So I just basically say, hey, here's what you need to do. And I'm trying to be as specific as possible about what they need to do in the revision. And I try to really frame it, in terms of some good parts about what they did. And I try to not make it seem too punitive. As you may suspect, students they feel like they failed if they didn't get complete. But I try to reinforce this idea that it's not a failing grade. It's just that the way I grade, they have, the specifications and the bar is pretty high. So to actually get it complete, there's a lot they need to do. And especially on the first paper, I try to sort of really make that bar high enough so that a lot of students don't actually complete it. It can be demoralizing to some students, right? Because they're used to just maybe getting that C or that B and then moving on. But really a C is not going to be good enough. And sometimes even a B, what might be a B in other circumstances, isn't good enough. So, I really try to frame this. And sometimes I have to talk to students after I send this email. They'll come back at me and they'll be, when I first started doing this, I had a student that really, ended up dropping the class because he just didn't, he couldn't believe it, that he didn't get credit. He thought it was like a failing grade. And I didn't do a good enough job explaining to him why, he got the feedback he did and why, the grading method I was using. It took a little bit of practice to do that. All right, Nicole, next slide. All right, so the last other thing is that students also do peer feedback. So I have students read other drafts of other students' papers and then provide feedback to each other. And here are the questions on the next slide that I use for that. And I just do this in a discussion forum. So they upload the paper draft in a discussion forum before it's due, by the way, so that they can give each other feedback that might be useful for their final draft. And then it's just a simple little 2-question prompt, what they thought was the best part, right? Lead with what they thought was good, and then suggestions for, and I give them options here because I want them to know it's not necessarily a critique. It's more of a, what they were confused by, what they wanted to, what do they disagree with or take issue with, and what do they wish was expanded upon. All right, my research, I want to go quickly to give Nicole some time and leave time for questions. So I'll just go quickly through this. So I chunk the research project. And just like I do with the module papers, their first significant project that's due just past the midterm is their annotated bibliography. I email them the feedback for this so that they know exactly what they need to do for the final project. And they don't get a grade in Blackboard until they respond to that email and say, oh, I understand, or here's what I don't understand, or, what more do I need to do? And if I don't get that reply email from them, they don't get the grade. So it may require a couple of emails again to say, hey, listen, I didn't hear back from you about my feedback. Do you have any questions? And you're not going to get a grade in Blackboard until you respond. And then finally, on the last paper, again, end of semester feedback is always kind of tricky, right? You want to give them feedback, but so many of them aren't going to read it. So that's where I use the audio comments again. So I give them all feedback at the end project so that the students that are really engaged and want that feedback, they get it. And the others, it really wasn't a lot of my time to have to write detailed written feedback at the end. So that's it.
Well, that's excellent, Chris, because it's really a lot of engagement, and that seems, just the thing that we need. I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 courses that I teach, and they're similar in a lot of ways because each of the courses, Western Civ, I'm just going to pick on my Western Civ 2, as well as my College Success or Cornerstone course, depending on where I teach this course, are really large courses. So they're survey courses, they're introductory, there are multiple sections. There can be a huge range of diverse students in these classes from different majors, looking for different degree options, returning students, just so many different minds at the table. So I think my approach that I'm going to share in some examples are a little bit more in some ways traditional from what Chris shared, but they have worked really well over the years for me. Even to the point where, students provide that feedback at the end, telling me that they really learned a lot from the feedback. So that's really invaluable for me to hear their feedback on how I'm giving feedback. So also another thing I should say is that there are assessment components for these courses. So in a way, my feedback is contributing to really important benchmarks for our college. Gen Ed requirement is a Western Civ. So it is a requirement for many majors, Gen Ed, and also for a new concentration in history that we've created. So again, I see the importance of the feedback leading up to these are traditional graded courses. College Success is only a 1 credit and Western Civ is a 3 credit. But both survey designs really require me to cover a lot of content in a short amount of time, again, to diverse students. In the College Success, I just wanted to point out a few things related to the kind of feedback that I give. I'm really mindful of the fact that there are transferable skills that they need to gain in this course, not only to retain them and help them through their persistence of their degree, but just purely writing reading, grammar, research skills, information literacy skills, as well as how to think like a scholar, how to be successful, onboard them to college life and the courses that they're going to confront. And since the motivation varies actually in both of these courses, I tend to get a lot of students in the first and second week like, oh, I have to take this course. I want to just sort of open up their world through the feedback that I give and show them that not only is their engagement critical, but also that I'm here to help them, and that how to sort of develop that growth mindset. So, okay, so in the online history course, and I teach this in all modalities, actually, high flex, hybrid, online, and in person. They have 5 graded exploratory learning activities that they complete. And I'm just using a 15-week semester as a rule, although I will modify this depending on how long the delivery is. And mainly on a lot of their written performance, I'm using inline grading comments, but I've also built a YouTube channel that provides quick how-to videos that I can link to, mostly the summary feedback boxes, but sometimes the inline grading feedback boxes. So these can range from links to our writing center resources to more assignment specific tactics that I find that they need in that area of their work. I also provide links to these how-tos in those class announcements that I build at the beginning, or that I address if a whole group of students need some help in this or that area. I'll put out an announcement with a link, or even a video of me doing that sort of thing, like a primary source document analysis, or there's a timeline activity, how to actually do that, or a piece of that. They also have, everyone has an end of semester research project called the Game Changer paper. It's kind of become a famous assignment over the years at our college. And they really approach that research project very hesitantly. And then at the end, there's a lot of celebration because they choose their topic and all semester they research it. In that research project, there's peer review. There is an embedded rubric that they see at the beginning of the semester. So as they're working through the process, they get to see sort of the range of expectations. And every step of the way, I'm giving really detailed inline grading. This does take a lot of time. But again, because I can turn to those pre-built videos that I have, it's very helpful and it makes it much more engaging than just a ton of written feedback. And then students will present a final presentation that's posted in the discussion that everybody is engaging in. And to actually build out that presentation, they have had to incorporate specific feedback that I've asked for throughout the research process. In the college skills course, it's much more discussion based. There's weekly discussions with an interactivity and content embedded rubric. And I usually start pretty low and then build. So I think they really need to see improvement in their writing across the semester. I use the summary feedback box, but I also jump into the discussion as little as possible, but as much as I know will help. And I also love using interactive announcements. This is something that Canvas allows. My Blackboard does not, where I teach. But these are announcements. When I put them out, they can reply or they can like, so I can see, sort of the popularity of an announcement any given week. And then in the college skills course, there's a final research paper as well. Again, I set up a really structured peer review where I try to pair students intentionally. And students actually get to use some of the tech tools that I'm using as an instructor to fill out a rubric, do inline grading on their own, and provide summary comments. So that's a full loop. And I try to model throughout that entire semester what I'm expecting in that peer review activity. So here's just a look at the inline grading feedback that I use. I try to color code. This, again, I find is easier in LMS like Canvas, but students tend to look for the red, the green, or the purple. They know what that means. I've created a key at the beginning and it's part of our class culture. I put a lot of comments in the form of questions that I look for responses to, or I'll do follow-up conversation with that student in an email or a Zoom, meeting conversation. And I already talked about these other things, but one thing I didn't mention is saving comments for future use. I always do individually address a student with their feedback, and I'll tweak comments that I've saved. But if you can just build like a comment bank that works really well for these large, especially survey classes, that is a huge time saver if you're doing inline grading. I wanted to show this as a counter example to an introductory course. I think it's really important to meet the student where they are and scaffold your feedback. So in my college skills class, a student looking at this level of feedback would be really overwhelmed. I would never just on a first, intro assignment do this. But for a student that's progressed through a whole semester and is used to what we're doing, I might even just use the word tools to provide a lot of detailed comments and feedback. I just wanted to also show how I use the links to the YouTube videos. So here I've just posted in the summary box a link and identified where in the paper that needs to be fixed. In this case, the student submitted a paper that wasn't even in the correct format. So I'm going to link them to a how-to before we even advance from there. Here's a look at my own feedback studio. So I can see how many people are actually viewing. I can use the dashboard and check out statistics and edit and make new videos that I feel will be really popular and helpful. So always check the analytics, I think is a good practice. We have a lot of data at our fingertips. So I love embedded rubrics. So this kind of speaks to design and delivery. They really help students in the beginning set a clear direction, show them levels of achievement and the criteria I'm looking for. And I find that they save a lot of time. And you don't have to invent your own rubric because there's just so many great examples. Even if you modify them, I think that's a great practice. This is a look at a Canvas type course that I teach in a different institution. This is a college success course. And this is just a look at, I've put an announcement out and then a student's asking a question. So this to me is like the best because we're in the beginning of a week, we haven't even gotten into things and they're asking a question that I can address. So that's a really great feature. And I also like if they're just able to like and give a thumbs up to announcements that I put out. So we can use the statistics built in our LMS to spot trends. If you notice that, students aren't logging in when they need to be, you can provide feedback to address that. You can be proactive. Also look at the previous week and just spot trends. Hey, check out this reading. I see you've missed that. It can also help you really individualize your feedback and make it more meaningful. You can also find things out if you set this in the beginning that students are skipping over. It can be really interesting to look at their habits and see how they're engaging in your course. So I find that very helpful. And here's a sample at just a very basic dashboard on a list of students who have viewed certain materials for that week. At a glance, in less than a minute, I can sort of see where we are and where we might need to be. And this is just a Blackboard system view. So you can go to your performance dashboard and by student, you can really get and generate many different reports as long as you set this up in the beginning. So I would recommend working with an instructional designer, or if you're building this yourself, learning the tools that you can do at the beginning of a class to save you time throughout and at the end. I also just wanted to, and I'm being aware of the time, talk a little bit about how I use SafeAssign or Turnitin and how I've made that routine in my courses. So I actually create a draft area. It's like a sandbox that students can just unlimited amount of times submit for their research paper drafts. And then this way, myself and the student can have a conversation. about how to cite properly, or different kinds of sources to use, or why their match is the number that it is. So I'll follow up with an individual meeting with students or a group of students if scheduling works better, or I might also send them a how-to. So, definitely check the report, check it often, and engage with students about their reports. I find that they really like to know about what those reports mean. The color coding is great. It makes sense to them, and it really makes for a better end result on the paper. So again, with SafeAssign or Turnitin, just like any other extra tool that you're using, provide opportunities for practice. So in this case, it's a high stakes paper, but there's just ample low stakes practice. And I like to turn, what might appear at first as a way too high match as a teachable moment, and provide, an extra opportunities to submit that. So here's what this would look like on your end with a paper that was submitted and the matches, but this student got to practice before submitting that paper. So we would have discussed, why their match was what it was. Okay.
Yeah, I'm glad you finished with that, Nicole, because I think all these tools, I mean, I use SafeAssign now, but they're not good enough on their own. You really need to fill in to students why they got the score they did, or what it means if there's a high match. I mean, sometimes more often than not, those of us who use that tool know that it doesn't mean plagiarism if it comes up as a high match. It usually is there's a quote that didn't get put in quotes, or it was in quotes, or something along those lines. So that's a good point. All right, so I guess now we're just curious to hear, what you have, any questions, or I know there was a question here about recording. I'm going to put the link to the presentation, or at least a read-only copy, in the chat, since we did use Google Slides, so you guys can have it there. But everything will be posted on Otter after this Otter website after in a day or so. But any questions, anything you want to ask, or anything that you're doing that we didn't mention that you want to share? I mean, feel free. We got about 8 minutes.
I'm not looking at the Google Doc, Chris, but I was curious if anyone uses, like elements of gaming with those built-in achievements in their classes. I know for that passport experience that myself and a colleague built, there are like over 1,000 students enrolled in that. And so we can't, provide feedback to everyone, but we use those achievements to help them self-assess and progress through. So I think that's an exciting way to apply technology as well.
Definitely. So Madeline is asking about, if you don't have the audio feedback option in Blackboard, what else to use? So Screencast-O-Matic is one that Jamie mentioned earlier. I could find the link, but you just look up Screencast-O-Matic. There's a free version of that. There's just more steps if you're going to do it that way. I mean, the beauty of the Blackboard thing, it's all integrated. But if you were going to use Screencast-O-Matic, I suppose you would just download the paper, and you would probably just highlight passages, save that, and send them a link. Audacity, Lindsay's recommending. So there's a question there for you, Nicole, from Steve. Do you see that?
Oh, the Game Changer paper. Yep. So more information on that. So I can actually, what I'm happy to do, if anyone wants to email me, is I can actually send you the assignment. It's an entire semester long project that starts with a proposal that has to be approved. So the approval process is really fun because sometimes their topics don't even fall in the dates of the course. So it's really a great way for me to assess prior knowledge coming into the course with such a diverse class. And then just throughout the semester, we build. Once they have their topic, then they start to gather research, create an outline, develop a thesis, which is that in itself takes 2 weeks of just feedback to get that one sentence right. And then, all the way through drafting, the peer review, the paper, and then the presentation. So I'm happy to share more about that assignment if anyone would like to contact me.
Yeah, in smaller classes, I think that at the graduate class I teach, that's what I do. I mean, I have the students initially meet with me before they submit their semester long their project proposal. So we usually, obviously we used to do that in person before COVID, for those who are local to near where I live in Rochester. But now, we just have a Zoom meeting or a phone call. And I just, like you said, you assess what their prior knowledge is, what they, where they're at. And then, you kind of come up with a project together that, that they, might be a little, just enough of a stretch for them. Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Exactly.
There's Nicole's email. If you want to go to the last slide, both our emails are there. And we any other questions or thoughts? I hear something in the background. I don't know if someone's trying to talk and they're just mic's not working. Hear those squirrels.
I don't see any of the comments, but I'm sure people are fully processing all this information. It's a different way to think about it. Thanks for sharing, Chris and Nicole. We really appreciate it.
Well, we're happy to be here. We all sure spend a lot of time giving feedback, so we may as well talk about, I think this is a starting point for discussion, and I'm always curious to pop into other people's classes and see what they're doing and borrow their ideas.
Good.
Yeah, one thing we didn't, I just think it really is demoralizing when you feel like you're putting so much time into giving feedback if you feel like students aren't utilizing it effectively. So, I don't know. I had a realization, not too long ago that I just got to do it differently. And I know it sounds simple, but, I think we all, and do what works for you. I think that, you could see Nicole and I have very different approaches to giving feedback, even though I think philosophically we both recognize what we want students to get out of feedback. So I think that's one of those things that really you got to figure out what works best for you and then just run with it.
Agree.
All right. Well, thanks for everybody for coming. This is fun.
Thanks to Chris and Nicole. Thanks for everybody for your time and your attendance and your participation in the chat today. It's been great. We hope to see you again tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for the Science of Learning Part 3 at 10 o'clock in the morning. We'll see you then. Thanks, everybody.
See ya.